So when you're tasting whiskey, are there any particular tools that you use, analytical tools, or any ways of examining the whiskey?
Yeah, well, I think it's always it's good to have something like a flavour wheel, or even better to have someone to bounce things off. If you're both, like I said previously, of tasting whiskey, which sometimes is not even the most experienced person in the world, and just to have notes bounced off you, or to take them from a flavour wheel. Well, actually, I don't get that, but I do get this, and or sometimes you can't quite put your finger on it. And then to scratch away, I'm a bit of a doodler, and I would be scratching away on my notes, but whether I come back to read them ever again is another thing. But it does help to draw them out of myself, to be able to either interact with flavour notes or somebody else, and then to be putting those thoughts to paper as well.
I always find the big block that people have, and I include myself in that, is how do you put into words what you're experiencing in your brain. It evokes memories, it evokes pleasure, times, occasions in the past. But how do you put that into words that somebody can understand? And so having that discussion, I think, and I'd certainly write notes, sort of brain diagrams, connecting, and that just gets vocabulary, just gets set, and then you can start to have a discussion about that. So wheels are useful. Just having a brain dump of what the flavours are.
Yeah, and even who are you writing for? Are you writing for yourself, or are you writing for a blending team, or are you writing for other people? And there's a different language, that, I remember somewhat embarrassingly, I discovered in a cupboard once some poetry that I'd written when I was 16. And just visceral cringe, couldn't burn it quick enough. And then I looked at the tasting notes and said, well, this is not terribly dissimilar. Whiskey tasting notes are a way to revert to this naive idealism of one's youth, where one feels very empowered saying soft notes of such and such. And the guy this strain has just reimagined itself in my life. And but again, people are willing to tolerate a certain sincerity in tasting notes that they would not tolerate in any other description of any other thing.
You literally use flowery language.
Yeah, and then it's about again certainly with the left hand, when I'm doing kind of writing about whiskey for a pop audience, you're trying to get a point across, or to be evocative. You're trying not to talk to yourself, but to talk to other people. And what I've often found is if you get these lists of tasting notes, you see them on labels, and it's just a bunch of adjectives with commas. And nobody reads them. I don't read them, and I think, well, geez, if I don't read them, who does? Because but if you say 3 or 4 things about a whiskey that really, again, I think Charlie MacLean's Dead Guillemot about one of the Isla distilleries is, if you say one thing well, it resonates, and it sticks, and you don't need to actually list as many adjectives, and you do get some very flowery, notes that you start seeing phrases like to the fore, and what like Jane Austen's letters might have looked like, ways that people would not stand talking in any other circumstance. But at the same time, that kind of sincerity, that naivete, there's nothing terribly wrong with it. There is a certain joy about putting this stuff to words. What I've often found with tasting notes in general is that whiskey kind of emboldens you to return to life, with a new love for sensory experience at all. People sniff a whiskey and they say, oh, there's notes of bubble gum and, asphalt and this and that, in a way that you don't walk down the street saying, the whiff of asphalt and this, or hold up a peach. Notes of peach, notes of wine gums, stick your nose into Maynard's. But I do find myself, the last time, I was at a family event and there was Maynard candy for the younger cousins, and I did find myself thinking this is a taste, and you're returned to life with a newly invigorated love of smelling it all, and it's only because you've encountered it in this strange social contract with the dram, and we're so enthralled to find these every day, to recognize these things. And I think keeping tabs on that is a very enjoyable sensation in and of itself, you know, to be able to walk down the beach and see some hapless dead guillemot and feel the joy in that moment is something whiskey, you know, has brought to a lot of people. And I think notes in that sense, you know, whether they're effective at all, are a great kind of mental exercise. They're very, you know, and I often find this, and I think a lot of people, especially when they talk about, dare I say, favorite whiskies, you know, when you have touchstone whiskies, there's a few things, if you know, you'd remember about one that you really like, and there's kind of, whether it's the like waxiness in Clynelish, or some very specific trait, the like leather in John's Lane, and you find yourself returning to these kind of primal things that you know, there's one or two notes or something that run as a kind of an artery system through everything else that happens, and it's tied up with memory. It's tied up with
very much so.
You know,
I mean, the one tool, if there's one tool, one tip I would give anybody, and it's one that when I'm teaching about sensory appreciation of sensory analysis, is to have a question in your mind. Never again pick up a whiskey and just drink it, because the question might be absolutely simple one. Do I like it? Do I not like it? But then it starts to grow from there. Always have a question. What's the peated level like? What's the floral level like? What memories have I got with this? But if you don't question yourself, it just automatically it just passes by, and you just get feelings of pleasure, and that's very pleasant, but you don't really taste it in that analytical way.
That kind of prompt becomes a launch pad.
Yes, exactly. To
another kind of experience.
So I always warn people, if you want to go down this route, you'll never approach foods again quite in the same way, because you'll always be asking, you'll always be sniffing and asking, what's that like? What's this like? What's that element like within this?
No, absolutely. And again, if there's one thing that I think whiskey has brought to my life, and I think to a lot of the lives of whiskey lovers, is that you do get this sudden new appreciation for food, and just for casual smells. You know, long after the dram, it teaches you through this kind of, you know, prompt and you know and pleasantry, whatever again contract is occurring with the drink itself. You return to life, kind of being interested in the smell of, you know, ash after rain, kind of these strange, the smell of old wood chops. And you know, people go on, especially when you talk about some of the peaty whiskies, some of the more sulfury whiskies, they talk about deeply unpleasant smells with great joy, and so do I. You know, I say, oh, this smells just like the bottom of an old boot. And then you find yourself enjoying, and you know, and they tap into these, you know, these strange sensations. That just smells like, you know, industrial rubber, and wood shop, varnish, nail polish remover. You know,
there's something perverse about humans, that we start off liking the immediate sweet smells, associated smells, you know, floral and fruit smells, but actually they find them quite cloying after a while. We find them quite, you know, we start off liking lemonade, but then we actually want to move on to something. It's got deeper, more unpleasant smells within there. You know, we start off with cream cheese, but we actually want to eat blue cheese, move on to something. There's something perverse about it.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
It fascinates me, but I don't know what that perversity is.
And again, you get these, you know, all these crevices of whiskey culture, especially when people talk about either closed distilleries or distilleries that have changed over time, and there's this running elegy for heavier, more kind of lino smelling, more sulfurous, more, all the like faults become these kind of lost virtues of the past. You know, these non-sweet, you know, these kind of darker, more kind of earthy notes that people are always complaining about being lost. You know, and there's now an itch to reclaim a lot of them. You know, and again, like it is tied up. You know, for me, outside of, you know, one of the other circumstances I probably drink whiskey the most in is in a pub, and there, you know, it's a very different experience because you're with people. I usually have like a stout along with, say, like a Powers John's Lane or something, you know, that I've had many times, and it's hard for me to disassociate that experience from the like warm lit places in the rain experience of being in a pub at all, and the smell of lino and the smell of varnish and the smell of, like, you know, all of this that's part of it. I think, well, if that had never been part of my life, would I really in any way associate stout and.
I mean, this is true that one thing that characterises Scotch whisky above other brown spirits is the faintiness in it. By faintiness, I mean some of these unpleasant, almost butyric type notes that you're talking about, and yet it's characterised in Scotch whisky. That's we really have that note there, and I don't think it's coincidental that Scotch whisky is the most popular brown spirit in the world, and because we've got these some unpleasant notes. If you look at the bourbons or cognacs, I would even suggest Irish whisky, you don't have that note, or you cut at a point where you don't going to have those points in there. Certainly when I'm working with distilleries, I always say, well, faints are your friends, put some faints in, because people like it and find it intriguing, even though they're quite unpleasant notes.
No, absolutely. I mean, even within Irish distilling, when you see the romance around the silent distilleries, quite a few of which were double distilled, and even the ones that were triple were heavier cut then than they are now, and all of the elegiaism gravitates almost magnetically back to when it was heavier, and then Scotch whisky still for the most part double distilled, but even in that context, the elegiaism gravitates to, well, do you remember when it was a bit darker and a bit more kind of rough around the edges, and those were the good old days.
It doesn't mean a harsh flavour. It doesn't mean a burning harsh flavour. You still want a smooth, complex
kind of
flavour.
A musk.
But it has that. It has kind of a musk on it.
The one thing I'd like the the cleaner, but not even whether it's clean or not, the more pleasant and rounded sweet flavours are often the most simplistic and easy to enjoy, but the more, I suppose, what we would talk about, we were talking about perverse, kind of unusual, peculiar flavours are the ones that are more evocative. And one of my greatest pleasures, my father lost his sense of smell almost 10 years ago, and as I was starting my whiskey distilling journey, so that really was the kickstart to make sure that I use my sense and how powerful a thing it can be, not just for pleasure but for evoking memories. And I grew up I suppose holding on to my grandmother's jumper and in her kitchen, where there was an open peat fire, there was always freshly baked bread. She was a Connemara, west of Ireland woman, so her idea of a sweet treat, as a reward, was to go to the press, which actually only had seaweed, because she was a big fan of seaweed and maybe raisins and things like so. Like certain whiskies and it was a farmyard as well, and certain like unpleasant characters like you can get with peat smoke or seaweed or whatever else. It's immediately transported back to being 5 years old, burying myself in the back of the cupboard, hopefully finding something that's not seaweed or raisins, or the odd chance there may be a chocolate digestive somewhere. It's those, it's that ability, and it's all mad to think that, or my grandfather's old boots or whatever else in the bottom of that glass.
I think we've all got memories like that. I remember going to school past a bonded warehouse. It used to be in the centre of Dundee, this bonded warehouse, and the smell that used to come out of still, when I go into a bonded warehouse, I'm 8 again, passing by.
That's the real pleasure,
walking reluctantly to school, and that smell of whiskey hitting me as I walk past the Stewart's cream of the barley warehouse.